Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another in the series of Understanding Mental Health from Oxford University. And again, so this is the last one in the current series. And I think before we start, I'd just like to say thanks again to Dora Lowenstein and Saffron Weiss, and also to Tom Stutterford of AGL Communications for helping us with this. It's been a fantastic series, and we're thinking about what to do next. Tonight, we've got a very interesting conversation, I think. Before I get onto that, though, I should introduce myself again. I'm John Geddes. I'm Head of Department of Psychiatry in Oxford, where we work very closely with all the academics here to try and do research and answer some of the key questions facing the population. So we've been involved a lot in fighting the COVID illness and the virus, but we also do a lot of work looking at developing better treatments for mental health. And they range from psychological therapies all the way to drug therapies and increasingly to digital therapies like virtual reality. Tonight, though, we've got a really interesting conversation around mindfulness and mental health. And we'll be joined later by Professor Willem Kuyken, who's an academic in the department, and Monty Don, who I will introduce more fully later on. But if I just start off with Willem Kuyken, I mean, it's a great privilege actually to be head of department in Oxford, because you get these most amazing people coming in who are both brilliant, but also determined to kind of create new treatments and help people. And that combination, when combined with a wonderful skill to be able to actually get things done, can be really powerful. And Willem's one of those people who came to our department a few years back and has led a program of mindfulness research that is really pioneering and has really put that intervention, I think, on the map. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Willem. I'm going to hand you over to you now, Willem, and then we'll join you later with Monty, and we'll have the opportunity for questions. So if you could post your questions into the Q&A, we'll also be looking at the chat function, and then we'll go through as many of them as we can later on to get a good live conversation going. And I'll be chairing that, and I'll try and do it as interactive as possible to keep the conversation going, but involving the audience as well. Willem, over to you.
Thank you, John. And to add to John's very warm welcome to everybody indeed from all over the world, all the nearly 500 people who are joining us today and for the subsequent online recording. What we'll be doing in the next little while is talking about mental health, mindfulness, and gardening. And what I want to do is I want to draw on both science and the wisdom traditions. And I'd like to suggest that we start with a very brief mindfulness practice. So if it's okay with you, and just follow along only if it feels comfortable, just maybe taking your awareness, taking your attention, and just turning it inwards. Just turning it inwards to the state of your mind just now. What's the weather pattern of your mind just now? Is it curious? Is it alert? Is it interested? Maybe it's a bit tired. Simply noting the weather pattern of your mind. Now, very intentionally, very deliberately, bring your awareness to the sensations of breathing. Such a simple invitation to track the sensations of this in-breath and this out-breath. Just letting go of thinking, simply sensing. Thank you. If you shut your eyes for that, maybe just opening them again. I'd like to make 3 points. The first point I'd like to make is that mindfulness training can prevent recurrent depression. And I want to tell you about a young man that I met recently. I'll call him Sam. Sam was about 17 or 18 years old, and he was already at that young age suffering from anxiety and depression. He talked about having thoughts, or even kind of sounded like voices in his head, who would denigrate him, give him a hard time. You're no good. If you go out, people won't like you. This won't work out. He said it was like having a bouncer in his head, like a nightclub bouncer. What he started to do with mindfulness training was do what we did just now, begin to slow down, steady, and recognize these thoughts in his head as just that, negative thoughts. And he did something more than that. He befriended the bouncer. The bouncer became an ally. So when he went out, the bouncer would say to him, "It's okay, Sam, I've got your back." And then when he was standing in the nightclub queue, he described once hearing the bouncer say to him, "It's all right, Sam, we're going to be just fine. We're going to have fun this evening." And this is one of the very characteristic parts of depression, is this very negative self-talk that can be a feature of depression. What else are the features of depression? Well, a pervasive sadness, a loss of interest in things. It's not the same as everyday sadness, not the same as grief. These are normal human emotions. This is a much more pervasive state that has physical symptoms as well, like sleep, energy, and appetite disturbance. And Andre is going to put up a poll now. And what I'd like to ask you to do is just have a look at the poll that comes up on your screen and answer this very simple question. Has anyone close to you, a friend or a family member, or perhaps even you yourself, suffer from depression? And it's a no-yes question. Normally, we'll see the results shortly. A very large proportion of people will say yes to this question. Both Monty and I have talked about our own experience of suffering from depression. It's a massive problem in the world. Some 250 million people in the world today will meet diagnosable criteria for depression. In terms of lifetime prevalence, there's about 7 billion people in the world. Nearly 1 billion at some point will suffer depression at some point. This is clearly a massive problem. And as John Geddes already alluded to, Oxford has been at the forefront of developing psychological treatments over the last 25 years, including cognitive behavioral and mindfulness-based approaches for depression. And what we've done in our group is we've developed an approach called mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, which is a way of helping people like Sam learn to recognize the thoughts, the behaviors that are part of recurrent depression. Help people like Sam to stand back and respond differently to those thoughts. And in at least 10 randomized controlled trials now, we've demonstrated this is better than usual care and probably about as good as maintenance antidepressant treatment. It's in the clinical guidelines of numerous countries around the world and becoming more and more accessible through the work here in Oxford and elsewhere. We're beginning now to think about how we can help young people before depression even starts. The second point I'd like to make is that mindfulness might have a much broader application in the contemporary world generally, and in the pandemic that we're suffering specifically. This pandemic has exposed many fault lines in our society. It's certainly made many of us realize vulnerabilities, but perhaps also questioned how we lead our lives. So I'm going to put the second poll up now. During this pandemic, have you in any way reevaluated your life in terms of what's important to you and how you'd like to live your life? And again, Andre will just make the results of that available to all of you shortly. In spite of what the media and the bubble in which we live says, across the world, for the most part, people are living longer, in better health, with greater economic security than as little as 10 years ago. But we have a mental health pandemic, as I've just illustrated, and an almost willful neglect of human capital and the potential for young people's flourishing. But mental health is something that both wisdom traditions and psychological science have an awful lot to say about. We know how to develop mental health, and we know how to develop human capital. In my book, Mindfulness, co-written with my friend and colleague Christina Feldman, we argue that when ancient wisdom meets modern psychology, there are no longer a set of ideas or practices, but they actually become a route map that guides us to be more present in our lives, with ourselves and with others, with clarity, kindness, and ease, and in ways that enable us, resource us to meet some of the major challenges in the world, which after all are going to be solved by the human heart and the human mind, as we've actually just seen with all of the vaccine developments. The final point I'd like to make is that the metaphor of gardening can be a fantastic metaphor for thinking about training the human mind and heart. In fact, in the ancient languages of Pali and Sanskrit, the word for meditation is bhavana, which actually translated literally means cultivation. And it usually has a prefix describing what is being cultivated. So Sita Bhavana means cultivating the mind and body. So what we're doing with mindfulness practices is we're cultivating mind states in the same way that a gardener cultivates the garden. Another parallel is that for gardening you need certain conditions: soil, water, nutrients, light. For mindfulness, you need intention, attitude, and practice. A third parallel is both mindfulness and gardening need wise discernment. I don't do a lot of gardening, but when I do a bit of gardening, I sometimes have to take a photograph and phone a friend and say, is this a weed or is this a plant? The same is true with mindfulness practice. Is what I'm cultivating here wholesome or unwholesome? Another parallel is gardening and mindfulness, sometimes a bit romanticized, idealized, but they can actually be quite dirty and sometimes uncomfortable work. But nonetheless, in the midst of it, they can bring real joy. And then finally, something which I think will come up in the discussion later, is both gardening and mindfulness have been shown to support well-being, and maybe even through similar mechanisms of getting outside of ourselves, being part of something bigger, accessing wisdom, a sense of appreciation and joy, maybe. I don't think this gardening is trivial. In fact, I think it's radical. Anybody involved in the natural world will say that what we're doing to the ecosystem in the world today is not sustainable. I'd like to argue that actually the same is true for what we're doing to our minds. The way we're sometimes treating our minds is not sustainable. There's so much more work to do in the next 50 years to understand how to support and develop mental health. And I'm really hopeful that we're going to make enormous progress. I'd like to just finish up with a quote, in fact, from Monty Don, from an interview he gave a little while ago. Here's what Monty said. Gardening's easy. Stick it in the ground the right way up, and most plants will grow perfectly well. I think we'll come to see that mental health is also not rocket science. What we need to do with mental health is to address the external things in the world that cause depression, inequality, deprivation, abuse. And then at an individual level, again, it's not rocket science. Do the things that give us joy, meaning, and connection. And in the same way that Monty Don says plants will grow, mental health will follow. So just before I wrap up and hand back to John, I just want to acknowledge the team that I'm incredibly lucky to work with and alongside my students, my collaborators, the university department that I'm part of, and the people who fund my work, the Wellcome Trust, the Rip Black family, and the Oxford Mindfulness Foundation. Thank you. I'll hand back to John now.
Thanks very much indeed, Willem. That was terrific. And I don't know if I could just invite Monty to turn on his video and Mike.
Here.
Hi, Monty. Welcome.
Hello.
And it's a great pleasure actually to introduce Monty, because I remember we were just thinking about this before we started this evening. It must have been back in the early 90s when I think Monty first started doing his gardening article in the Guardian or the Observer, one of the two, which he did for well over 10 years until he took over on Gardener's World. But I remember looking, and one of the very first articles that I read by you was talking about your own depression, but also the beneficial effect of gardening upon it. And also the change in seasonal, you know, as the winter came and things like that. And at the time, I really seized on that because, you know, I've been in psychiatry for some time, but it was still quite unusual for people in the public eye to talk a lot about their own experience of depression. So I think we have come an awfully long way in that period, and people like you are much more likely. But you were a real pioneer in those days. But also, and I think you've done this ever since, you do it with this sort of with this thoughtfulness and articulacy that is really kind of striking. So when we wanted to do some films back in the late 90s, we came to you and you very kindly helped us, and we did that for the NHS. The link up with depression though, and obviously people will know, I'm sure, Monty as being the much loved presenter of Gardener's World and a load of other programs, and with his wife Sarah, he's written some most fabulous books as well. But the other thing was when we were making a Radio 4 series earlier in the year, really focusing on the fabulous book Anatomy of Melancholy by Robert Burton. And we were interested in what are those activities that humans do that provide some protection, some relief from depression, some kind of solace. And one of the first I had to think of was gardening. And a lot of that was influenced by Monty's thinking. There's a whole range of other things that we can get into. And it was a wonderful experience going down and interviewing Monty for that series. And again, he just gave of his own experience so wonderfully. So I think we're going to really have a good conversation now, because Monty, having given that introduction, I'm now going to bring Willem back on. And I look forward to a bit of a conversation about what are the parallels, you know, what are the active ingredients for you of gardening? How does mindfulness come in? I'd just be really interested to hear you and Willem explore that a little, please.
Well, fascinating to listen to Willem, because those parallels, although they're obviously there, actually quite tricky to unravel, because I was taking this thing about gardening so often is seen as a link to a positive future. And one of the things that I've often felt is that if you can plant a seed or a plant, you are making an active investment in a future that is hopeful and positive. I mean, it could be the fruit that comes, or the flower, or whatever it might be, as well as a season. If you put a plant in today on the 1st of December, it's not going to do anything until next spring or next summer. So what you're saying is, okay, I'll buy that. I'll take this fallow period, which is you can see with your mental state, and then it will blossom. There will be a positive future. But then I was thinking, Willem, what you were talking about with the whole point of mindfulness is being aware of the moment, of here and now. And all my own background in meditation, or my sort of rather pathetic struggles with meditation, have been about being 100% aware of the present. And there does seem to be a bit of a contradiction in that. I don't know what you think about that.
I think, Monty, for me, it's such a rich inquiry, isn't it? And I think it's really just an apparent contradiction, because it's sometimes said that actually yes, it's about awareness in the moment, but in this moment, at the risk of sounding slightly esoteric, the whole of the past is represented in this moment. All of our previous history and conditioning, and even our genetic code, is represented in this moment. And one of the things that's really important about mindfulness is the point of cultivating this moment is the point you made, Monty, which is you're creating the conditions for the seeds of this moment to actually go forwards in a fruitful way. So if you feed the anxiety or the depression, or if in my case of Sam, he listened to the bouncer berating him, that will just lead to more depression. But actually the act in this moment of befriending that bouncer leads to a different outcome. And I think that's maybe one way of unraveling the analogy of working in the present moment in a way that actually leads to different outcomes.
I mean, one of the things that I both have personally found very helpful and do and practice on practically a daily basis, and also endlessly you have reported experience of this, is that all the dreams, all the plans, all the hopes for the future actually only exist now.
Yeah. And
that this moment now, even this moment of us talking now, is everything we could ever want it to be. There are no qualifications to it. It is complete.
Yes.
And if we can be aware of that and enjoy that and accept that, maybe for its limitations. I mean, for example, I'm really cold talking to you because I've got no heating in this room, but that's fine, that's okay. But gardening sort of has that built into it. It's part of the deal. Once you step out into the garden, that comes with the package, I think.
Can I ask you a question? I love what you're saying there. And of course, gardens have, certainly in this country, they go through seasons, right? So we're in the winter right now.
Yeah.
And a friend of mine says to me, it's an illusion that actually trees and bushes are dormant in the winter. There's an awful lot going on. And I went for a kayak at lunchtime today. Along the riverbank, there is a huge amount going on. And there's these buds and there's all of this going. Well, when you go in the middle of the winter and there appears not to be much going on, what are you still then able to be fully there? Or are you thinking in the spring this will blossom?
No, it's a very good point, that. I mean, I have in my life at various stages suffered really quite badly from SAD, and by now there have been times when I've really been struggling, and have, the idea of enjoying the present is so far from any kind of experience that would seem farcical. Although there is something about the pearly quality of light, the way that the branches of the trees become pencil lines rather than splashes of color, the way that birds appear out of the mist and then disappear into it rather than streaking, and so that in itself, that's in a sense a passive experience because you're observing rather than living. But also at the same time, I mean, in purely horticultural and botanical terms, there are all kinds of things flowering and growing, and also even the process of death or dying back. For instance, this has been a wonderful year for apples. We've had thousands of apples, and we've collected as many as we can, and we've juiced them, but hundreds, if not thousands, are left on the ground, and slowly they're decaying. And as they decay, more and more birds eat them because they're easier to eat than run. So there's this process of the apple decaying, yet the birds and the voles and the hedgehogs and whatever eating them. And actually, I know from experience that by the time we get to March, there will not be an apple pip left on the ground. Everything will have gone. But that isn't a loss. I mean, that is as much part of the process of the apple, in a sense, as the blossom and the form of fruit that is happening too. So in a sense, the falling leaves and the gathering of the leaves and the making into leaf mold, the fact they rot down, is as much part of the process of the emerging of the leaves in spring. And I think if you don't have to intellectualize that. As a gardener, you are part of that. It happens. It is a flow. And as long as you can be part of the flow, almost the business of mindfulness, if you like, is taken care of. It's happening. It's there, you know.
I would be the last person to want to, in any sense, romanticize depression. But you spoke about your experience of seasonal affective disorder, and I too have suffered from episodes of depression. I think the older I get, the more that that idea of, as bad as this too shall pass, really, there's a real faith in that statement. That actually in the midst of this, I know this is not a good place, but this too shall pass. And actually more than that, I always bring to mind Wordsworth and this idea of a deep distress have humanized my soul. That actually, I really don't want to romanticize depression in any way, but there is a sense that actually this has actually brought some learning for me too. So my question for you is, with your seasonal affective disorder, what have you learned? Because you spoke about it in an almost light way as we're heading into December.
Well, I mean, I found that it took me a long time to understand it was connected to seasons, but actually it would begin in July or August. And I would have this sense of, and I've said this before, and it seems very pertinent to me, but I'm not sure it may be to others, but is that the ice was getting thinner. Yeah. That I was skating over the surface of things with apparent ease and fluidity, but actually that was becoming more and more tenuous and difficult, and that also becoming increasingly aware of the deep, deep fathoms of darkness beneath that ice. And that I was getting closer and closer to it. And by the time I'd get to mid-October, November, that would become a kind of grey, ashen, deadening of all senses. And the garden would be no use. I mean, one of the things that, and this is the opposite of any kind of romanticization, the garden becomes a reproach, a muddy smear. That you've failed at, you're not working with, you're not being mindful of, you're not connected, you're not doing anything. You are, the garden and you are mirroring each other. And that's clearly awful, awful. And one of the things, like you, I've learned as I've got older, is both techniques of counteracting that, because I still feel it, but there are things I've learned how to do. And also this sense that if you can give in a little bit more, actually what you find is maybe something that will help. And you rightly point out, it could be the quality of light. It could be that you see a little primrose there, or there could be just, and it's only glimmers. You only need a crack just to see a glimmer of light. And then that takes you to the next stage. It's not a solution. It doesn't make you better. It doesn't solve the problem, but it gives you, it's just a foothold to cling on to. And then there's another, and then there's another. But in practical terms, and one of the reason John mentioned that I started to write about this and talk about this a long time ago, was partly because I felt I had nothing more to lose. I felt that my life had reached a kind of rock bottom. And I didn't care. I didn't care what anyone thought about me or whatever, because there was nothing left that I wanted to cling on to. And of course, that's often the best place to get out of it. And that's quite a good place to be in some ways. And also a profound sense, and I still feel this really strongly, of pity that there are so many people who can't speak, who don't have a voice, who are suffering terribly, horribly, and need help. And so anything you can do, if you see somebody drowning and they're holding a hand above the water, you grab it. And I think that it's as simple as that. And you receive letters of people who said, I've never been able to speak to my friends or my workmates or whatever it might be. And you've just said something that hit the point. So on that level, it's easy. I can just spout and waffle and I have a thing, but it just might help somebody. But I think the key thing, and you've talked about this, and this is why I'm interested in talking about mindfulness, is there are techniques that work. There are things, clearly this being aware of the present moment, of drawing in. I've been to a couple of retreats in India, trying to learn to meditate in a sort of conventional yogistic way. Not very successfully, I have to say. But one of the things that obviously you're taught is that life begins with a breath in and ends with a breath out. And that is it. That is your life. And so breathe in, that's your life coming in, and breathe out, and it's going. And if you can focus on that point between the in-breath and the out-breath, then you are there. That is all that there is. That's all you'll ever have. That's all you own, and it's everything. It's the world. But at the same time, and I find that very difficult, but the other day I was finishing planting my tulips, and I had 43 pots to plant up. And I had to mix up all the compost, and we make our own compost and do that. And there's a lot doing. And I realized that for about an hour and a half, I didn't think about anything else at all. And that was that was when I'm most comfortable. That is my meditation. And I think that's what gardening can do. You have a job, a process that is in itself repetitive, but it's partially creative. It's partially mundane, but it takes all your attention without in any way that being stressful. And then when it's done, there is the hope and the future and the seasons and this investment that we talked about. And I think that gardening, not uniquely, but certainly particularly, combines that complete immersion in the process of the present. The putting the bulbs in the pot was not so different from the in-breath and the out-breath, and also the investment in the future.
There's an artist who recently won the Wellcome Collection Prize for depicting depression. And one of the images, it's a photographic image, is of him immersed in dark water. And I just want to riff off some of the metaphors you've been talking about, because that is the experience of depression. It's an experience of being immersed in blackness, in bleakness, in deadness. And a place that and it has a really cruel twist to it, because it also adds a couple of elements, which is you're the only one. This is uniquely you. And this is likely to go on forever, and there's nothing you can do about it. So it's got this kind of cruel twist to it, that the very things that might help you in those moments are disabled because you can't see them, you can't hear them. You're drowning, you're immersed in this chap's photo, and that's many people's lived experience. So it's interesting to hear you talk about mindfulness and immersion in ways that take you out of yourself. And this is what I meant by rocket science, that actually some of the things that will help with depression, really the cruelty of it is you just don't feel like doing them, and you don't think that they'll help. And sometimes they can be paradoxical. Sometimes they help, sometimes they can't. But one of the things I know you've written and talked about dogs at various points, but a lot of people with depression have talked about the dog that says, we're going to go for a walk now. I need to go for a walk now. And the person with depression is going, I don't want to go for a walk. But when they go for a walk, they feel just a little bit better. Yeah. Yeah. The dog has actually made them do something that the depression is saying, don't do. And then the final thing I want to just riff off from what you've said is this idea of compost. Because Thich Nhat Hanh, one of the kind of foremost people who's communicated mindfulness in the sort of contemporary world, often talks about compost. And he says, you know, we put stuff that we think is dead or dying or finished, and we put it in the compost heap. But that is what actually is the nutrients for what comes next. And I think some of the struggles that people talk about, the difficulties they encounter, even in the midst of this pandemic, for example, can be the kind of compost that actually, as you come out of it, you go, actually, that was fruitful. That was actually maybe something that had something good within it.
Well, I think, oh gosh, I mean, there's so much to pick up on that. But in terms of, I know that my wife has often said to me, she'll look at somebody or look at a picture of someone and say, they haven't had their crisis. And you know that there are certain people you meet and know is that they have had their crisis and they've come through. Mm-hmm. And in their face, in their eyes, mm-hmm. is a measure of suffering and of knowledge that amounts to wisdom. Yeah. And it you know, it may be an experience that's very different to yours. It might, you know, it doesn't have to, we don't have to share that. But until everybody who's been through and come out the other side is immeasurably enriched by that experience, even if they would have given anything not to have had the experience in the first place. And that's certainly, I think, is a question. I mean, one of the things about compost, which I'm always saying, is that compost is not rotting material. Compost is alive. Compost is alive in ways that we literally can't imagine because the numbers are so great, the trillions, and then you run out of language to measure it. And the effect it has on your garden is not to fertilize it, but to trigger life. It's life. It acts like a starter on a sourdough. And you add it to the soil, and then you get this extraordinary relationship between plants and the life in the soil. And your compost has acted as that trigger, and it's topped it up, and it's enriched it, and it's added to it. And I mean, I hadn't taken the metaphor this way as you've done it, but if you take the experiences of depression, which tend to be negative, they tend to all be absence of experience, you know, absence of you ruin relationships, you ruin your job, you ruin your pleasure, because it's a very, very destructive state of mind. At least that's my experience, is you actively alienate all the people and the things that you want to love and that love you. You do everything you can to stop it for lots of reasons. But if you can see the process as creating a life that will enrich further life, not just an experience that's given you a kind of wisdom, but actually inside it is a whole new way of thinking and working, then that's empowering. But I don't think when you're depressed you can be aware of that. The nature of being depressed is you're not in that space at all. And I think,
okay.
Well, I think that the gardening analogy is much better with a dog. Is that I always say to people is go outside, put your boots on, even just putting your wellies on. I mean, one of the most important aspects of the garden here that have got me through really bad times have actually been the chickens. We have chickens and we keep them at the end of the garden. And they have to be opened in the morning and fed. I have to collect the eggs in the afternoon, and then just as it gets dark, they have to be shut up. So that's at least 2 and usually 3 trips to the end of the garden. And that doesn't matter if it's raining, snowing, or whatever. So like the dog going for a walk, they have to do it. I mean, the last thing you want to do, and there is just that sense of go outside. And it doesn't matter what you do. And with a garden is you know, just gather up some leaves or prune one sprig of something. Sow 5 seeds, plant 1 plant, and it grows. And the experience, but that's the key to it.
Can I just come in, Monty, on that point of in the midst of a really dark depression, there's not much that people can do, because I think that's something that's worth just saying again, because I think it's really important for people to hear that, but also the people on the call who are looking after or know someone who's suffering from depression. This is just quite a dark place and it's hard to come out of. And just very, very small little things are things that can help. But I also wanted to just go back to your one of the points you made about something within the experience can actually be empowering and helpful. So Sam and his bouncer, that's a very empowering idea for a young man of 17 or 18. He's got this bouncer with this strong voice that has his back. And many people will know that Winston Churchill famously called his depression his black dog. He would talk to his wife about the black dog is here. And in the midst of a depression, he'd just say, I need to go to bed. I need to retire from life for a little while because the black dog is here. But it's the lead up to an episode of depression. With your seasonal affective disorder, I guess July, August, and the coming out of that, where the creativity comes in. The black dog is making an appearance, and as you're coming out of it, the black dog here is alongside me. I think that's where it can be woven in, so it becomes actually, as you say, something that is empowering. Yes, I think that's not quite the right word, but
so yeah, it's always I've got to break in, and it's always the worst thing when things are flowing so well, but we do want to allow the people in. But what a fantastic conversation. I do feel really bad. We might be able to come back to some of these themes, but what I want to do is just extend it to some of our 500 in the audience, because they've come along. And there are some things that I think are really relevant. So I'm particularly going to select those questions that I think fit in with the flow of the conversation. And one of them from Andrea Yanda, Monty, and I'd be interested, Willem, in your take on this as well, is that given what you've said about it's the small things, about the things, getting one or two things in place, then Andrea asks, what daily or weekly rituals of mindfulness do you engage in via gardening or otherwise to keep you and your family grounded in a world of daily distraction and disaster? So, I mean, I think that, well, I'll leave it with you to answer, but I'm just interested whether there's a routine that you go through, given what you said.
I mean, I'm personally somebody who loves routine, and loves ritual. So any excuse is great, and I'll do it. But actually, and the more serious point of that is, if you feel that the world is spinning apart and flying off, the more routine and ritual you can impose on it, the more it holds together. But yes, every morning I go around the whole garden and I open the greenhouses and I open the chickens and I walk the same route, and I really look at the garden. And it hasn't changed hugely since the last time I did that, which was at very most 24 hours ago, but I might do that 4 or 5 times a day. But what I've learned is that if I really look every time, I always see something. So that although I'm doing the same thing every time, I always see something new or different. And it might be minute. I mean, it might just be a dewdrop on a leaf, or it might be something, suddenly think, wow, yes, that's what I need to do there. I mean, for instance, the other day I was going around and we have a little bit of the garden called the mound, and it's got steps leading up to it. And it's just not quite right, but I haven't been able to work out one. And suddenly I thought, I know what it needs. It needs a rosemary or a lavender hedge either side of the steps. And I've been looking at that and thinking about it and what to do at least 100 times, more like 300-400 times, but it just comes right. And I think it goes back to what Willem's talking about. It's just this, it is mindfulness. It's pay attention. It's what Huxley always used to say, is pay attention. And so that's my ritual, yeah.
Willem, ritual?
I love what Monty said, this kind of pay attention, but with a sense of awe and wonder, to including the small things. I would just add to that something about topping and tailing the day. So I think just finding some space at the beginning of the day to just come back to the present moment and maybe set an intention for the day. It doesn't have to be some grand intention, but just an intention to be present, or an intention to be kind, or an intention to manage difficult meetings with care. And then at the end of the day, a bit of a reflection back. And that's not an invitation for self-recrimination. It's an invitation to actually, that was a lovely moment when I walked the dog, or I was with that friend. And, I could have done that a little bit better, but not a kind of beating oneself up at the end of the day. So maybe just topping and tailing the day, I think. And actually, if you look through, many people describe that as being a helpful way to bookend their day.
Yeah, thanks very much. Michelle Armitt, I mean, there's a lot of interest, isn't there, in social prescribing that we're seeing at the moment, and people being encouraged to go out. And Michelle asks, what factors should be considered for community gardening when working with people with anxiety or depression? She's researching at present from an occupational therapy perspective. Thank you. How can we formalize some of these things that you're talking about into?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of work going on with the community gardens, and more at the moment. It's difficult, that one, because of the ones that I see, and I see, to be honest, I see more films of them than involved, although I actually was involved in one community garden myself for a few years. It's the same in the sense that you have to engage everybody involved with ownership. The problem with a community garden is they tend to be taken over by those that are doing most of the work for obvious reasons. They could be the person organizing them or the person who's coming most often. And actually, they only really work well when everybody, however peripheral or reluctant their participation, feels that in a sense it is theirs and that they have a stake in it. And I think that's really difficult to do well, but when it works, then something bigger, then a genuine sense of community happens. But the energy needed to make them work tends to be almost the most destructive aspect of a community garden, and that's the difficult tightrope you walk.
Willem, just on this, there's a question from Amelia Osgo who says, is there any research comparing efficacy of mindfulness training done as usual in groups, face-to-face or online, and conducted outside in nature? So is there an interaction between mindfulness training and where you do it?
The honest answer to that is I don't know, and I think what I do have is a set of resources that a long PDF document I'm happy to make available after this call, maybe, but I don't know the answer to that question. Is the honest answer.
You would think you would. I mean, in light of what we're all talking about, you would expect mindfulness exercises and training and application to be particularly successful in a benign natural environment. So, you know, in a beautiful place that wasn't too noisy, that you know, had lovely trees or shades that wasn't too hot. I mean, we've all been in very beautiful places and found it much easier to be mindful in any sense of the word than you would do in a noisy room or on a busy street. So you would expect that to be the case, wouldn't you?
Picking, just Willem, let me just ask a question about this. Picking apart, I mean, what do we know about the active ingredients of mindfulness? What do we know about the neuroscience of mindfulness? Because, I mean, as you will know, there's a lot of people in Oxford, like the Botanic Gardens, colleagues at Kew Gardens, who are interested in the potential benefits of green space. I'm just wondering about, you know, have we closed the gap between the ancient tradition and the CBT and knowing what's happening in the neurons in the brain?
So Monty's made me brave enough to talk outside of the evidence base. So when I answered, instead of, you know, I answered as a scientist, but I feel I can let that go a little bit. But I will come back to the science. Actually, Monty, the case with mindfulness-based cognitive therapy is actually the opposite. Is that it seems to do best for people who've got a history of adversity. And the way I make sense of that is they've actually got more grist for the mill to work with. For somebody to do extensive meditation, it's actually quite a big ask. And if somebody comes to meditation and there's a lot of grist for the mill with recurrent depression, they find it tremendously helpful and transformative to be able to work, you know, with very strong negative thoughts and emotions. And the evidence does bear that out, that people with a history of adversity seem to do better with mindfulness than people without a history of adversity, for whom antidepressants seem to work better. Anecdotally, what I would say is when people come back months, sometimes years after a mindfulness class, nature, gardening, the outdoors is very often mentioned as exactly in the way you described, Monty, that there is a sense of appreciation and simple coming to nature. And I think that's about people stepping outside of themselves, stepping outside of the narrative and drama of the small self and actually seeing something larger than themselves. I remember this, it'd be fine to talk about him because he gave his permission. I remember this, this man I worked with who was a school teacher, and he suffered from recurrent depression. He was called Di Cohen, And he, after the mindfulness course, developed bone cancer and had a number of bone marrow transplants. And he used to write me from the wards about how the mindfulness was incredibly helpful to help him to work with the pain and to help him work with the isolation. And the last few emails I had from him was, I know that I'm going to die and my life has come to an end, but I'm now using the mindfulness to develop compassion to support my wife and my children, for whom this is now much more difficult than it is for me. So there was something about the work that initially was on the focus of depression and his self-critic becoming something much larger than that. And I think nature has a part in that. The piece about the neurosurgery, John, I'm not a neuroscientist, and so again, I'll be very cautious here. But the people who've done the most impressive work have used a very nice scientific paradigm. They said, well, if we're going to look at the neuroscience, let's start with the equivalent of the Olympic athletes. So let's start with very seasoned monks who've got 20,000 hours of meditation practice, and let's look to see what sort of differences we can find in those groups. And they do find systematic differences in exactly the places you'd expect to see, in attentional networks, emotion regulation networks, ability to down-regulate in the face of stress. But that's very different from somebody using an app like Headspace or something. Those are people who've got a very extensive mindfulness practice. And I think that's kind of, in a way, it's a no-brainer. It's something that you put a lot of effort and concentrated effort into, you're going to get bigger changes than something you start to do just a little bit. The same is true with musical practice or with gardening, I'm sure.
Well, one of the things that, as you say that, makes sure is, I don't think I have ever met a lifelong gardener who spent many hours actually gardening, who is a tense, anxious, troubled person. They usually have the ability either to find the harmony and the peace that they need, or it's there anyway.
Yes.
And I'm sure that those two things are connected.
Thanks very much. My good colleague Helen Adams from Oxford asked the question, many people do not have ready access to a garden or a pretty park green space. Or a pretty park green space can often equal a square of muddy grass and tarmac playgrounds. So how can we optimize the mental health benefits of nature plants for everyone who doesn't have access to, a gorgeous garden or?
Well, the last figures that I saw were that I think roughly 85% of British people have a garden or access to a garden. And that's dropped in the last 10 years from over 90%. So the figures are falling quite a lot. I mean, there are now there are 1 million people that don't have access to a garden at all. But one of the features of my children's generation, sort of the early 30s, is a huge increase in houseplants. And these are people who are living in shared houses, who don't have gardens, or in flats, or living with their parents, or whatever. And it seems to be, and this is from the anecdotal evidence that I get, is that they are gaining much the same benefits from being surrounded and living with houseplants as, say, someone like I do, or those of us who have a garden do with our gardens. So it's something to do with a relationship with plants, be it a beautiful tree in a park, your herbaceous border, or your 2 or 3 houseplants on the windowsill, it seems to me.
Thanks very much. Willem, any comment about that?
It's of course a very good point, and of course depression hits people who live in deprived circumstances harder than people who live in more middle-class circumstances. So I think in that sense, that's a very fair point. Maybe just a tangential addition to what Monty was saying. I'm forever thinking about how to develop mindfulness-based programs, and one of the mindfulness practices that people really resonate with is this, you invite people to imagine themselves as being like a tree. So actually a sense of being rooted, a sense of the trunk of the body being upright, a sense of the arms and the head being like the branches and the foliage in connection with the world. People find that a tremendously helpful metaphor because of the rootedness and because of the organic nature of a tree. And of course, the beauty of a tree is it it can bend with circumstances. And actually it changes through the seasons. So it's using a natural metaphor to support a mindfulness practice. My experience is people find that so very, very helpful.
Thanks very much. Well, look, we're going to have to draw this to a close now, I'm afraid. But Monty, Willem, thanks so much. It's just been an absolute pleasure to listening to you. And as always, it's the language and the sort of the almost poetic, well, no, definitely not. What do I mean, almost? Your grasp of metaphor and both of you, I think you really sort of light up this area, actually, which is one of the things it needs. So it's been absolutely fantastic. Thanks also to a very, very active audience. And we've had some great questions. We've not been able to answer them all. And we've had an amazing amount of chat going on that's flicking away there in the background. I have been keeping an eye on. So thanks to everyone for participating. There's a load of stuff in there that's worth looking at. Of course, this session will be available online on YouTube in a week or two's time. Andre, the mental health, will make everyone aware of when that is. I want to once again thank Dora and Saffron for getting this series going, and to Tom Stutterford of AGL Communications for making us all work properly and communicate. I was wrong. This is not the last one. We've actually got another of these sessions coming up in a week or so. We don't know the date yet, but it's going to be on conspiracy theories. And we thought that this was particularly interesting because of all the kind of vaccine hesitancy. And we're interested in that kind of things. As I said, we work very collaboratively in Oxford. So we're working with the vaccines people and looking at the kind of belief systems that people have. So that should be a very fascinating session again. And lastly, I've also been reminded that I should ask people to think about donating to our research. Today is something Giving Tuesday or some such, and it would be terrific if people would want to contribute to help us continuing with the work we do. We rely on that. Giving Tuesday, thanks very much, Andre. Andre's just put it in the chat function, so thanks very much for reminding us. And on that note, I think I've done everything I need to do. So thanks once again to Monty and Willem.
Thank you very much.
To everyone.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Monty.
Thank you. Yes, goodbye.
Thanks, Willem.